Dr. Froma Walsh, thank you very much for accompanying us this afternoon in this interview.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I'd like to start by looking at traumatic loss and how it's different from other types of losses.
There are different ways in which losses can be traumatic. For instance, if it's sudden, unanticipated, a violent death, or a sudden departure or abandonment or disappearance of a loved one or a parent. It could be a situation of ambiguity where it's traumatic because you don't know, will a missing loved one be found? Are they alive? Are they dead? So there are different situations that bring trauma to a normal situation of loss, which is why we need to understand each loss situation. Most of my work has been over the years with bereavement, with the death of a family member, but many of the elements in working with this are also useful in working with separations, divorce, migration issues, other kinds of loss that aren't necessarily death, but that sometimes we say leave a hole in the heart, and where grief is very complicated and long-lasting.
So it's not necessarily that traumatic loss implies multiple losses.
Well, multiple losses, if you're looking at a family system, for instance, there's the death of a loved one and the person who that was, and there's also the particular relationship. So each child in a family might have a different relationship with a parent or a grandparent or an oldest sibling. For a youngest child, it might be that the oldest child was like a second father. So each relationship is unique. And so we need to understand that it affects every family member, and yet in different ways.
In different ways. So it's the same loss, it's just how it affects different family members.
That's right.
That's
and that it's not only the direct effect of the loss, so say the death of a child for a mother is also going to be influenced by whether she's able to grieve with the father of the child, or whether he distances and is not available. And that will affect their relationship. How supportive he is will either assist or inhibit her grief process, and it will also affect whether their relationship becomes more distant or whether they in fact come closer because of their mutual support.
And so perhaps, just to see if I'm understanding correctly, that that loss, the mother's reaction or the father's reaction to that could also contain another loss for the child, for a younger sibling that lost the older sibling, but perhaps also loses the availability of mum and dad for a time.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or if one parent dies and the other parent is preoccupied with grief, or now has to become the sole breadwinner and care for the family, there may be the losses. We also worry...
So there's a complexity of
There's a
loss.
complexity in a loss situation. We also worry that if people make too many changes at a time or death or loss, they may move away. Children then have to go to a new school, make new friends. They've lost their neighborhood, their peer group, maybe their extended family. And we try to slow down the process of adjustment to loss so that, say, sometimes a parent is encouraged to quickly remarry so that the children have another parent. And they haven't yet really come to terms with the loss.
With the loss.
Or it might be that there's a death of a child, and well-meaning friends or relatives will say, oh, well, you can have another child. And they try so quickly that they haven't yet really given the time to integrate that first loss.
So could you describe how you would begin working with the family that we've been talking about that has had this loss, let's say of an elder child? How would you begin working with that family to manage all those different losses that you've been describing?
Well, I want to start by asking questions that are kind of filling out the loss situation. Tell me about that death or that loss. What happened? And then what do you remember from it? Kind of taking them to it. What changed with the death and loss? I would want to know. Because it could be that the whole family split apart because the death of a child, especially with a violent death. I work a lot in Chicago with children who are murdered through gun violence by other. We have a very high rate of homicide in Chicago. And sometimes the family is so traumatized by that violent death that they just splinter and fall apart. One might turn to alcohol, another might become preoccupied with caring for another child might go into the streets and try to take revenge. So we're really looking at how it affects everyone and the reverberations of that loss to each family member and all of their relationships. So I mostly start by really trying to assess the larger loss situation.
And would you meet with the family all together in that first session, or does it depend on how the situation is, the family have been referred to you?
Well, I start with who's coming in, but I want to get multiple perspectives.
Right.
But I'm going to kind of go with the flow of issues. So I might work with a father-daughter, I might bring in other siblings, I might work with a sibling group so that it isn't just the child that is presenting for symptoms. To have them talk together about what the loss of a parent has meant for each and all of them, and how do they try to support each other. Because I want to build a sibling caring network as well.
And working in those different dynamics would continue throughout the process.
I want to pay attention not only to the person and relationship that was lost. I want to recover what that life was like and the meaning of that relationship. And I'm bringing in photos, stories. That's part of the healing process. So it isn't just the trauma of the loss, but it's reintegrating all that that person meant to them in their life. The other part of that is to, as we're finding in the bereavement field, it isn't just grieving and letting go, but it's more of a transformation of that relationship to continuing bonds through spiritual connection, through memories, through storytelling, through legacies, through deeds in memory of. But the other aspect when we're working with family systems is not only the person and the loss, but how did the family deal with the loss? Because often the trauma is even more in the family's inability to pull together, and their breakdown can bring more problems of maladjustment, especially for children in the family, when they're sent off in different directions, or a parent is unable to care for them, and they're not sure who's going to care for me now, what's going to happen to me. Feeling that there is a healing network within the family.
And this might be an impossible question to answer, because absolutely every family is unique and every situation different. But how long approximately would you expect to have to work with a family facing such a difficult time?
Well, in so-called normal grief, meaning everyday losses, that are less complicated or less traumatic, they don't necessarily need grief work. Sometimes we've over-therapized. But in situations where the death is more complicated and the loss has much more meaning and may bring more disruption to the family, sometimes at the very beginning they are preoccupied and overwhelmed with just the immediate arrangements. And so, and it may be that they have a lot of support through their community or their religious faith community or extended family. But then everyone goes back to their lives, and often families need more help maybe 3 months or 6 months down the road.
Right.
And it might be that we do brief work with them, but we also want to normalize the grief experience in the sense that it's going to be an ebb and flow. There aren't just stages that you move through and then somehow it's resolved and you put it behind you. That really isn't what loss is like. It's a chapter in the book of life of the family, and you go on living, but there are going to be memories, and there are going to be touchstones, milestones on the anniversary, on Mother's Day, on a birthday. Another family member has a baby, and it brings it all back very fresh. And to anticipate that that's going to be just part of the journey that they travel after a loss.
Can we come on to resilience now? And could you tell us your understanding of resilience? How do you explain resilience?
Oh boy. First of all, let me say why I was attracted to the whole concept of resilience. Because in all of my training in the mental health field, everything was so problem-focused, and families tended to be blamed, mothers in particular, for any problems that would come up, particularly of children. And in my own work, I was doing research with families who had a schizophrenic offspring and other adolescents and young adults with serious problems. And I wanted to study a so-called normal control group because I thought we've made assumptions in our field about the so-called schizophrenic mother or the refrigerator mother that produces autism that really came out of theories and out of experience with clinical families, but we knew very little about non-clinical or so-called normal families out there.
Yes.
And so I became curious, went back for my PhD in normal human development, and wanted really to learn how do families succeed, not just how do families break down and fail. And so it was my professional flight into health. I kind of redirected my attention because all of the literature and even the research funding was all problem focused.
Yes.
And I was starting to worry that any family that we would see, we would be diagnosing everything wrong with them. Just like even in a genogram, if we're asking questions about everything that's wrong, would we even recognize strengths in the family? And so I've kind of dedicated myself to not to neglect of what's wrong, but to really rebalance, to look for what's working, what the strengths or the hidden resources are, untapped resources, and how can we mobilize them and how can we strengthen them. So I was first interested in studies of so-called normal and healthy families, but I was bothered because they tended to be typologies and they tended to be based on middle-class, intact families, not under stress.
Right, yeah.
And I was a clinician and teaching clinical students and working with families, and they said, but you know, those aren't the families we see. And most of them, maybe they're not intact. They're very complex, and they're under stress, and they're in crisis, and that's why they're coming. So that drew me to the concept of resilience because by definition, it's strengths in the context of stress.
Right.
It's not just the ideal family or the strong family or a typology that you measure every family by, but it's what are the strengths that help families when they're facing a crisis or prolonged life challenges, and how can we learn more about that? So I was interested in the research on families going through divorce, immigrant families, remarriage families, that were really looking at what are the family processes that help children and families to go through those tough times and come out the other side. And the other part that I love about the research on resilience is that they find that in the qualitative studies when they talk to people, like, how did you get through that, and what happened.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't just survive, but they said, going through that experience made me stronger.
Right.
I
Right.
tapped into qualities that I'd never used before,
Mm-hmm.
like a father who's
Uh-huh.
now separated but sees his children on the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And he learns how to cook for the children to make breakfast,
Uh-huh.
or how to be nurturing, or how to hug. But I relied on my wife to do all those things.
Uh-huh.
Or the
Uh-huh.
wife who's now the sole or wage earner, and she has to put together a lot of skills that maybe she didn't need before. So there's that potential for growth that comes out of adversity.
Okay, so it's getting through, being strengthened by having come through that
That's right.
adversity and finding new things in yourself.
That's right.
Well, Dr. Froma Walsh, thank you very much for giving us this time.
Oh,
Thank
you're
you.
very welcome.